Got a basic question to start with today. How many of you talk to your children? Okay, just think about that. How many of you listen to your children? Well, that's good. We're off to a good start. I'm glad to hear that, because sometimes it can be frustrating to deal in those kind of conversations. There are times that it can be difficult, but there is always wisdom to be learned. I remember hearing the story of a kindergartner who came home from her first day of school and said flatly, "I'm not going back." And the parents asked her, "Well, why aren't you going back? What's wrong? Why don't you want to go back?" And she said, "Well, I can't read, I can't write, and they won't let me talk." Must have been Joan. I think that was Joan. So there is wisdom in children. I was also reminded of another story about a little boy who was wandering through the YMYWCA, and he got lost from his mother. And he made his way into the women's locker room. He's just this little boy, and all of a sudden the women see him, and they just start scattering and screaming and grabbing towels and grabbing anything they can and put it in front of him. And he finally looks up and he says, "What's wrong? Haven't you ever seen a little boy before?" The wisdom of children. It is so wonderful. One of my favorite stories came from a pastor, very, very famous pastor in the early part of the last century, Harry Emerson Fosdick, who was the senior pastor for a long time at the Riverside Presbyterian Church in New York City. One day he was walking through the park near the church, and he ran into a woman and her daughter from the church, and they chatted for a while, and before he left, he kind of jokingly looked at the daughter, and he says to her, the little girl who's about 5, and he says, "Now you be sure you tell your daddy that you talked to Dr. Fosdick today." And the little girl looked up at him and says, "And you be sure to tell your mommy that you talked to Susie Smith today." Children have wisdom if we will listen to them. But sometimes talking to children and talking to other adults can be frustrating, can't it? It can be difficult. And sometimes, especially in dealing with youth and children, we think we're reasoning and our reasoning fails. And we're trying to reason with them about correcting behavior or what needs to be done or what they're supposed to be doing. And what happens when we do that? How do you respond when the reasoning no longer works? What happens when push comes to shove, might we say? What do we do? As a parent, there are several options. And I've seen a variety of options from a variety of parents. Sometimes parents lose their temper and they begin to shout. Have you ever heard a parent shouting? And that could include yourself, by the way. Have you ever heard somebody just finally give up and say, "I'm so exasperated. Just do this as I'm telling you to do it"? There are parents that berate their children. There are parents that isolate their children, and one of the ways we isolate our children the most is that wonderful phrase when we're so exasperated we can't take it anymore, "Go to your room." Now, I know none of you have ever said that, but I've heard that parents have said that. And there's a problem with that that's so basic to growing up youth in the faith and growing up them in the way they should be and trained to become adults. There's a basic problem, is we're isolating them. We separate them from us, and that's never a good thing to do. But we always think it's a good thing to do, to be on our own, don't we? Or to put them on their own so they can think about it, so they can deal with it. And I think one of the reasons we do those kind of things is we've been raised with this idea of this rugged individualism. You know, we can tough it out. We don't need anyone. We can just figure it out. So kids, go to your rooms and figure it out. I mean, that's the way we look at that. That's the emphasis, the energy we put on that. And there's another myth that follows right along with that one, and that is this myth of self-sufficiency. That we're inadequate if we need anyone else's help. And by the way, that works as a parent because often we fail to ask for anyone else's advice or help ever. We just decide we should have all of that knowledge and do it ourselves. And somehow we think that if we can just send that child to the room who might be 7 or 8 or 12 or 17, that somehow they can just figure it all out alone. And this creates another kind of problem. Finally, I think it's this idea, this myth that we have in life in general, that it's just me against the world. I know we think that sometimes, and we think that as parents. I'm in this alone. Sometimes we don't even think our spouse is in it with us. and I'm in this alone, and we've got to do it. And we have this paranoia that develops within us that says these kind of things. If you're not for me, you're against me. If you don't agree with me, you're against me. And so we do these desperate things and just try. Now, I want to say something here. I don't believe it's wrong to correct. I don't believe it's wrong even to punish our children. But I'm talking about something particular here today that I think is a problem right now, maybe more so than ever, and it's that problem of isolation. Because when we isolate our youth, when we take them and we say, go to your room, you're stuck there, you're going to be there, we're creating some things we don't even know we're creating. Because once we're isolated, once we're alone, things happen, don't they? We know this. What happens with your imagination when you're left alone? Doesn't it just kind of run amok? And so we have a youth or a child in a room and their imagination is running amok and they don't even know what their parents are thinking or feeling about them because they've stopped. They've shut off the conversation. And so the imagination begins to run wild, and then we begin to think, okay, well then I'm going to take care of myself. I'm isolated, and so the most important thing is what makes me feel good. And both parents and youth can be guilty of that. We can be guilty of that in all kinds of relationships. And often when we're isolated, we sink further into that world of self. Instead of interacting with other people, instead of learning how to get along, we sink into this world of self. And you can see how this applies to all relationships. When we fail to communicate, when we fail to talk out issues, we just sink into ourselves. And our desires, what we think is right for us, can become obsessions. We can become obsessed about something sitting in that room. We can become obsessed about something sitting down there and thinking about how disrespectful our child was to us. And so we become obsessed. But when we become alone and stuck, often then it becomes hard for us to view other people as real persons. We're stuck in that room. We're focusing on satisfying our own needs. We're trying to figure it all out. And so isolation can cause us to fail to see other people as real people, people worth value, people worth loving and caring for. It should come as no surprise to us that so many of those that have acted violently in our culture and our society the last 7 years were loners. Those are the shooters at Columbine and at Newtown and almost all of the major incidents. If you look at their lives, they just sunk into themselves. They became isolated and alone. And then they began to have the paranoia that goes with that, and the fear of others, and the blaming, and the trying to figure it out. Isolation opens a door to all kinds of evil. And I use that word in a lot of different ways. But it opens the evil of things that just kind of press in upon us. And when we're young, and those things begin to press in upon us, then we decide, what can we do? Now that I'm isolated, now that I'm alone, now that I'm trying to figure it out for myself. And so we begin to focus on those things that self-satisfy us or depersonalize other people. And as we're driven away, we form this negative self-image. And you know what that leads to? All kinds of bad things. It leads to young people in our culture who are depressed. We have more depressed young people than ever. And we drive them into isolation, and we separate them, and we shut them off, and we say, go to your room and figure it out. That's going to help you become less depressed, I would guess. As a person who lives alone, let me tell you, living alone does not help you get over being depressed. Being alone doesn't help you deal with depression. I don't care how rugged you are. It does not help. And sometimes they turn to things like drugs, and we wonder why. They turn to these things like cutting and even suicide. And I know it's not for being sent to the room one time, but it's a pattern of isolating our young people from us and our lives. There's a reason that Paul said so many years ago, don't embitter your children. Don't embitter them. You should care, you should converse, you should talk to them. Do we? Do we talk to them in meaningful ways? Or is it always, I'm the parent and they're the child? I've seen that in families even when the child is 50 and the parent is 75. We can never talk adult to adult. It's always parent to child. How do we talk and converse with our young people? Paul stresses in the second scripture today the need to do things gently. There's a reason Paul says to do them gently and to carry each other's burdens. As parents, is that the way we approach parenting? Are we gentle even in our correctiveness? Even in our need to, when we have to punish because something so severely has happened, do we do it with malice and anger and frustration? Or do we do it not to embitter our children, but to help them grow and to change and with gentleness and love? Again, I know that some of us get easy to say today, this doesn't apply to me. My kids are all raised. This doesn't apply to me. I'm single. It doesn't apply to me. I don't have any kids. Bad news for you that are saying that. It applies to you. Because this kind of stuff applies to all of our relationships. How do we deal with our family, our friends, our work, our church? Do we talk to people? Or do we figuratively and sometimes literally say to them, go to your room? I don't want to deal with the issues. Or do we deal with them with an openness and a gentleness and to say, we may not agree, but let's talk about this. Let's figure out a way to work on this together. We should not be embittering them either. We should be loving them gently and carrying their burdens. And it's the call we have as people of faith. There's a wonderful story. Sometimes stories spread so far and so long, you don't really know if they're a story that happened in fact, or if they're kind of an apocryphal story, a story that someone made up at one time to illustrate a point. But either way, this story is amazing. To me, it's the kind of story that could have happened. It's the kind of story that should happen over and over and over again when relationships get strained, when there has been bitterness, when our children have been sent to their rooms that may be way outside of where we ever lived, and we're not seeing them at all. There's a story of a father who went to the local newspaper, and I believe I've heard the story two different ways, and one was in Brazil, and that's the one I tend to believe. And in Brazil, his son he had a terrible problem with his son. And they had a terrible argument, and the son left, and they never saw each other again for a few years. And he went to the local newspaper, and in the local newspaper, he placed an ad. And this is what the ad said. It said, Paco, come to the Hotel Montana at noon on Tuesday. All is forgiven. Love, Papa. On Tuesday at noon, when the father made his way to the hotel, there were over 100 young men there named Paco. And they were seeking the embrace and the forgiveness and the love. In our relationships with our children, with our youth, with others that we know, what is the main action word you use? I think it's pretty significant. What is the main action word? Do we send them away with our words and our actions? Go to your room. Go to the street. Go away from me. I do not want to see you. I do not want to be with you. Or do we use the action word that Jesus gave us? Come. Come unto me. Come to me, all the children. Come to me, all that are weary. Come to me, all that are burdened and heavy laden. Come to me. All is forgiven. Love wins. What words do we use? Do we push away? Or do we open our arms and say, come, all is forgiven. Love wins. May it be so for you, and may it be so for me. Thanks be to God. Amen.